The lack of classic Lizardmen content on this channel is absolutely appalling, so let's change that today. Welcome back to Anvil of Doom Miniatures. I hope you've all been well. Now, for every Warhammer army, there's that one mini that's kind of the cherry on top of the cake, or that jewel in the crown, and for the Lizardmen of Lustria, it would have to be the Slann Mage Priest. There have been a few iterations of these chubby frog boys, but my favorite would have to be the 5th edition Slann being carried by his loyal temple guard. I picked this miniature up a few months ago and I've been itching to get some paint on him, and there's something about the Lizardmen's Aztec vibe which I really love, and you can kind of paint them all vibrant with all sorts of colors, and that's what I'm going to try to do with this miniature today. I'm going to try to give him a real pop of color and try some new paint techniques and some new colors. Also, I've had a few of you reach out to me and demand more Lizardmen content, and it just goes to show that if you harass me enough, I will eventually cave and I'll paint whatever you want. But anyway, that's enough chit-chatting. There's a lot to get through, so let's get straight into it. There are a lot of pieces to this old metal kit, and one thing I noticed very fast was that it's not very painter friendly. Now, what I mean by that is that if you were to glue it all together and try paint it, it's basically impossible. There are so many hard to reach areas, and it's also equally as hard to paint in a sub-assembled form because there's not many areas to pin it or to kind of stick it to handles. Now, if I were to tackle this miniature back when I first started painting, I probably would have put it to the side because it's very difficult, but not today, because I believe if you can paint old metal minis or old lead miniatures, then you can pretty much paint anything. I'm starting out by blue tacking or gluing some bits to handles and bases to make life a bit easier for when I paint, but some pieces are tricky, like the temple guard's arms, so they'll need to be painted, then flipped and painted on the other side. This is risky and not best practice, as you may scratch the paint off when handling these bits, so if you're attempting this, I recommend having clean hands and to be super gentle. I also glue some pieces like the Slann's arm to his body and the majority of the Triceratops skull throne. Like always, I'm going to start with doing my layers first, and as the kit is quite large, I'm going to paint the temple guard first and then move on to the rest of the kit. I feel like if I tackle this in manageable chunks, it should make the painting process much easier. A few months ago, I painted an old box of skinks, and my goal was to make them look as vibrant as possible and to also make them look like they came from a tropical climate. I'm going to try to do the same thing again with this obese toad and his crew. To me, the Lizardmen are a bit of an anomaly in the old world. As I said earlier, they really take their inspiration from Aztec and Incan cultures, which is a far cry from the very European-like fantasy aesthetic that you get with other armies. They're kind of like this exotic option for people who want a bit more flavor, or for people who never really got over that early dinosaur phase in their life. And don't worry, I'm definitely one of those people as well. I'm a massive bird lover, and as we all know, birds are dinosaurs. But anyway, it's really fun to have this faction a part of the setting, as they act as the exotic inhabitants of a distant land, and if your army were to venture to Lustria for a bit of temple raiding, these were the guys standing in the way. They make the narrative really interesting, so I'm hoping they eventually make their return to the old world game and setting, fingers crossed. Today I'm also going to try something new with the true metallics and go for more of a copper or bronze-like colour instead of my usual vibrant gold. So on my adventure to my local gaming store the other week, I grabbed some Hashut copper, and with a name like that, you can't go wrong. So I've blocked in all my base colours and it's time to move on to the washes, but before we get onto that, make sure you hit the like button if you're enjoying the video, and also hit the subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with all my other videos. I'd really appreciate it, and I'd really love to have you on board. Anyway, let's get back into it. So as I'm applying the washes to these large lizards and the big old throne, I'm starting to think ahead and plan my next move. I want to select the colours I want to use and certain painting methods in order well ahead of time, so when the time does come to make the next decision, it's not as stressful and I've had a period to mull it over. In saying that, doing all this thinking isn't always going to lead to being super satisfied with your paint job. Sometimes I select colours that I think would look great, and when it's finished, I sit there looking at my mini and I just say to myself, you are a bloody idiot. I don't think mini painting gets enough credit for the mental puzzle that it truly is. There's a lot of moving parts, and a few weeks ago I was poring over the Golden Demon entries for this year, and I was trying to understand and break down a few of the entries at a technical level. Sometimes I struggle to paint a fairly simple mini out of the box, so the level that these guys are performing at with their intricate bases, dioramas, hand sculpted extras is hard to grasp if you really look into their entries. Let's get some layers on these mean lizards, and this was going to be a bit of an experiment. I'm a big fan of turquoisey blue Saurus warriors, so I'm going to try get a nice vibrant result. I go back over the bulk of the raised areas with some Stegodon scale green and Temple Guard blue, and then move on to some more pure Temple Guard blue. As you can see, I'm not blopping the paint on, I'm trying to give it some texture by doing small lines and building up my colour slowly. I'm making sure the paint is watered down slightly to a sort of glaze-like consistency, because this will help when building up that color as well. Now, I often get asked how long it takes me to paint these things. There were 10 separate pieces to these guys, and I'm the kind of painter that when I sit down, I have to get it all done in one hit. I started at around 8 AM and was finished the skin around 1:30 PM in the afternoon. I want to make the scales a similar color to the skin, but a bit more dark, so they look like they have toughened up over time. So instead of using Temple Guard blue again, I use Ahriman blue, as it's a little bit more deep in color. With the rest of my layers, I'm using a lot of similar recipes that you can find in detail on my older videos, but today I'm going one step further with the highlights and adding a brighter color to my final highlight. This will give me that extra bit of vibrancy I'm after. Also today, I wanted to mention the brushes I'm using to paint with. I'm mainly using brushes from the Army Painter range, as one of my awesome Patreon members sent me a Wargamer Regiment brush to try out, and at first I was struggling to get the tip and point sharp, but after a bit of playing around, I started to get the hang of how it behaved. I did think the hairs were a bit soft, but after playing around with it for a while, as I said, I got a little bit better at using it, and it does hold a really good amount of paint, and that makes life a bit easier. For the fine lines and the last final highlights, I'm using my trusty Army Painter Psycho brush, and I love that thing. For smaller details like eyes, you can't go wrong. The only issue with this paintbrush is that the paint dries really fast on it, so you need to move quickly when painting, or maybe just move to a more humid climate. That always helps. At this point in the process, I was extremely tired. I was kind of overpainting this thing. It felt like it was never going to end. There were so many pieces to get through still, and it really actually made me feel quite down about it. Finishing work, coming back, painting this and trying to get through it, but it just became a massive chore. I don't know if any of you guys ever felt this way, but it really does add this small stress in the background, and you have this voice in the back of your head that keeps saying you need to get this thing done. The way I tried to combat this was by making a promise to myself that the next mini I'm going to paint will be something smaller in size and something that really excites me. I've already picked out my next mini for the channel, and oh boy is it going to be a fun one. Well, I think it is anyway. Sorry about all the sulking, but as you can see, I sucked it up, stopped bitching, and I got on with it. I painted the Slann's little cushion a nice purple color, which I think works well with the reds and greens, and then it was time to paint the bone. Now, bone can be a tricky thing to get right, and it actually took me a fair bit of trial and error over a couple years to figure this out. I cleaned up the skulls with some more wraith bone, and for the areas I wanted to be a bit darker, like the eye sockets, I slapped in some Xandri dust. The biggest lesson I learned is that skeleton horde can be very streaky if you're going to mix it with water or use it straight out of the pot. I always use medium instead. It makes it way easier to work with, and what I like to do is make a mix not too heavy on the skeleton horde and do a couple layers of the mix and push the paint in the recesses where I want the skull to be darker. This process is actually very fast, and if you had a bunch of skeletons to get through, it would actually work wonders. Once the medium was dry, I then used some ivory, or you can use some bone white, and go over all the raised areas. I also add some lines to the Triceratops horns on the throne to give them some much needed texture. You could always try dry brushing this on as well if you have a model with a good amount of raised details, but today I'll stick with the brush. So with all that done, it's finally time to paint the chubby frog boy, which I've been really excited about. I live in the tropics, so I'm surrounded by froggos, which is really nice, so I have plenty of inspiration to take from. There's nothing more iconic to me than the Australian green tree frog. It's an animal that I grew up with in my backyard, and every wet season I hear them screaming their little lungs out, and it makes me feel right at home. So today I'm going to try give this Slann an off-green like look, and also to make the highlights a bit more blue so he looks like he has some sticky skin. And as I was doing my research, I did find this old bit of Warhammer art, so what I'm going for will hopefully resemble this as well. I'm using a completely new green recipe, and as I was painting this lazy froggo, I was actually a bit nervous because the idea I had in my head wasn't matching up on the mini. I feel like I may have gone a bit too bright with the undercoat and wash, but I just kept painting and decided to stick the course and see how it turned out. For the skin highlights, I used some Cyberite green, and this was a fairly pale paint, and it did require a few layers to show up on the mini. I was having a really hard time getting my highlights to punch through, so I decided to add some Gorse Blaster green to the mix to help. This is when the green highlights started to get a bit better and the skin started to come together a bit more. After spending a while working on this green, I was satisfied with the result, but if I had my time again, I would probably have gone for greens with more yellow tones to them to help it punch and be a bit more brighter, but you can't win them all. I used my trusty old yellow recipe for this bloated belly, but this time I started with some Avalan Sunset instead of bronze flesh tone, and then I tried to make the centre of the tummy a bit brighter by glazing on lighter yellow to the area. I wanted to try and make it look like there was some natural light hitting this chub gut, and after that was done I had some Dawn Yellow highlights and lines to give it some texture. For his large goggly eyes, I first filled them in with some dried bark, and then went over with some Troll Slayer orange, then some Troll Slayer orange and Uriel yellow, and then some pure Uriel yellow. And for his eyeball, I just used a line of dried bark. So the burnout was kicking in hard, and I had some bits and pieces to get to, like the nails and teeth, and I also had to go back over the areas where I wanted gold and silver, which I had to leave out because it made more sense to paint them last. This model also had these tricky little gems, a bunch of bangles, which I kind of glazed over and forgot about as well. There was just a lot to get through. So after all that, I thought I was finally done with this project, or kind of getting close. I had a few minor things to do, kind of like the metallics and all that stuff, but I looked over to my right and there they were. I forgot to paint the feathered poles and I was kicking myself. I decided it was time for some wet blending, as I could do this pretty fast and it would have a good effect. I want my feathers to be pretty flamboyant, so I'm going to go for a pink and purple. Starting out with some Xeris purple, I apply that to the base of the feathers, making sure I move fast so the paint stays wet. Then I slap on some pink coral from the top and then work the middle until I was happy with the blend. I then used some lighter purple highlights on the base and then moved on to some light pink highlights for the top of the feathers. We are well and truly on the home straight now, and it's time for the true metallics. And as I said earlier, I wanted a bronze-like look, so I went back over with some more Hashut copper to the raised areas, and then I finished up with another new color I recently grabbed, Sycorax bronze. I kind of feathered this to the points of interest, and I feel like it worked out pretty well, and it was nice to try something new. And last up for my silvers, I just went back over some iron breaker and then some pure silver. Now gluing this thing together was kind of like a small engineering project. It was actually very, very difficult. I actually couldn't record it all because I was too busy screaming and covered in resin and glue. It was an absolute nightmare. What I had to do was make sure the temple guard were kind of glued in the perfect distance apart. I also had to make sure that the frog could kind of slide in and not scratch any paint off him when I was kind of putting him in place. I also had to reinforce those feathered poles with some more epoxy resin on the back because that was an absolute nightmare. It was basically the hardest thing I've ever had to do in miniature painting, or the hardest kit I've ever had to build. Once that was all done, it was finally time to finish it up. I had to paint the base and I was so extremely happy. But here it is. Here's a 5th edition Slann Mage Priest. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of the video, guys. I really appreciate it, as this one was a really tough one for me. Again, I want to say a massive thank you to all my Patreon members. I really appreciate all the support, guys. And if you want to join the Patreon, the link is in the bio. This month, we're actually having a painting competition, the Mage painting competition. So if you want a bit of fun, head on over and join us for that. And that's pretty much about it. I'll see you on the next video. Cheers.